Imagine for a second that you are trying to verify a massive piece of breaking news today. But there's a pretty major catch.
Right, no internet.
Exactly, no internet, you have no video evidence, you don't even have a smartphone. You have to rely entirely on a chain of people who heard it from someone else, stretching across, massive empires, deserts, and decades.
This is wild to think about.
I mean, how would you ever know what is actually true and what's just a rumor that got twisted over time?
It sounds completely impossible by our modern standards, doesn't it? Most of us just assume the message would be entirely distorted by the time it reached you.
Yeah, the classic game of telephone.
Exactly. A giant, centuries-long game of telephone where the original truth is just buried under layers of political bias, faulty human memory, and, well, outright fabrication.
And that is the exact, seemingly impossible problem we are tackling today. This deep dive is centered on an extensive academic research paper that examines the life, the methodology, and the massive modern debates surrounding a 9th century scholar named Imam Muhammad al-Bukhari.
Yeah.
We're exploring how this one man attempted to build an airtight system to verify history, and how modern scholars across the entire spectrum view his monumental work today.
But before we dive into the man himself, we really need to establish exactly what this text is for you. We're talking about a collection of hadith.
Right, the traditions.
Yes. A hadith is the preserved record of the words, actions, and silent approvals of the Prophet Muhammad. And for Sunni Muslims, the collection compiled by al-Bukhari, known as Sahih al-Bukhari, is considered the most authentic book in existence after the Quran itself.
Which is huge, because it's a foundational text for Islamic law, theology, and the daily life of over 1 billion people. It is naturally intensely scrutinized.
It is. And that brings us to a non-negotiable ground rule for this deep dive. The academic research we're unpacking today tackles 100 critical questions about this text. 100. And it pulls from highly diverse, sectarian, and politically charged perspectives. We'll be looking at traditional Sunni views, Shia critiques, feminist and rationalist interpretations, all the way over to atheist and ex-Muslim arguments.
And we want to be absolutely clear with you right now. We are not taking any sides today.
Not at all.
We're not endorsing any theological, political, or ideological viewpoints. Our mission is strictly and impartially to report on and synthesize the fascinating debates contained within this academic source material.
Perfectly said.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really understand the magnitude of the book, you have to understand the origin of the man. Al-Bukhari was born in the year 810 CE in Bukhara.
Which sits in modern-day Uzbekistan.
Right, to a family of Persian ancestry. And his origin story, at least according to the traditional biographies, is incredibly vivid. As a young child, he actually lost his eyesight.
Yeah.
His mother prayed fervently for his vision to return, and the narrative states that she had this powerful dream of the prophet Abraham. And shortly after that dream, al-Bukhari's sight was reportedly restored.
It's a powerful narrative of divine favor, and it really sets the stage for his entire life's work. And he certainly needed that sight, because his intellectual journey was staggering.
To put it mildly.
By the time he was 16 years old, he had absorbed all the primary hadith education available in his region, and he hit the road. He spent the next 16 years traveling across the vast Islamic world. We are talking about journeys to Mecca, Medina, Iraq, Syria, Egypt.
Just massive distances for that era.
Completely. And purely to track down the people who held these oral traditions.
Because he was a prodigy, right, with a memory that became the stuff of legend. There is a very famous historical anecdote about a test he faced when he arrived in Baghdad.
Oh, the Baghdad test.
Yes, the top scholars in the city wanted to test his limits and see if the rumors of his genius were actually true. So they took 100 different hadiths and they intentionally sabotaged them.
They mixed up the chains of transmission.
Exactly. Purposefully matching the wrong chain of narrators to the wrong historical text. They then had 10 different scholars recite these 100 scrambled hadiths to al-Bukhari in front of a massive audience.
What's fascinating here is that he didn't just stop him halfway through to point out the errors. He sat silently and let them finish reciting all 100 fabricated pairings.
Just absorbing it all.
Yes. Then, relying entirely on his memory, he repeated each incorrect chain and text exactly as they had presented it. Only after repeating their mistakes did he proceed to correct every single one, matching the correct chain to the correct text for all 100 examples in sequential order.
It's just a superhuman feat of cognitive load and pattern recognition. which leads us to the staggering numbers associated with his career. The records state he studied with over 1,000 teachers and evaluated 600,000 traditions to finally select about 7,275 for his book.
Right.
And if you remove the repetitions, he essentially distilled it down to roughly 2,600 unique texts.
Now, those numbers, specifically the 600,000, face heavy skepticism from modern academics.
Naturally.
If you do the math on his 16 years of travel, evaluating that many traditions means he would have to process over 100 hadiths every single day. Modern critics point out that if he was doing deep, rigorous background checks on every single narrator, processing that volume daily is physically impossible.
Right. But the traditional defense provides some crucial context for that math. 600,000 doesn't mean 600,000 entirely unique stories. That number included massive amounts of duplicates with slightly different chains of narrators.
Exactly.
It included incredibly weak traditions that he could dismiss in seconds, as well as general historical reports that weren't strictly prophetic traditions.
You really have to put yourself in the mindset of an intense oral culture in the 9th century. Memorization was the primary technology of the era. Familiarity was key, so reviewing a hadith didn't always mean spending 3 weeks researching it in a library.
He was much faster.
It often meant instantly recognizing a known, flawed chain of narrators the second he heard the first few names. Much like how you might immediately recognize a spam email just from the subject line.
That makes a lot of sense. So, how did he actually build the filter for the thousands of reports he did investigate? Let's go back to our earlier analogy of trying to verify a rumor. Imagine you are doing a background check on every single person who retweeted a quote, tracing it all the way back to the original author.
That's a great way to look at it.
Al-Bukhari built a revolutionary methodology for early fact-checking based on 2 absolute pillars.
Those 2 pillars are adala and debit. Adala refers to moral uprightness and religious integrity. The narrator had to be known for strict truthfulness, devout religious observance, and avoiding major sins.
The standard was incredibly high.
Oh, absolutely. If a narrator was known to lie about mundane, everyday things like lying to a customer in the marketplace, al-Bukhari would completely disqualify them from transmitting sacred text.
Then you have the second pillar, dabit, which is all about precision and cognitive retention. You could be the most morally upright, honest person on earth, but if you had a bad memory, or if you were known to get details jumbled when telling stories, your narration was thrown out.
And al-Bukhari actually took this methodology a step further than even his most famous contemporaries. Take Muslim Ibn al-Hajjaj, who compiled the second most revered Sunni collection. He required proof that 2 narrators in a chain lived at the same time and could have logically met.
Which seems reasonable.
It does. But al-Bukhari demanded positive historical proof that the 2 narrators actually physically met in person.
Right. It is the difference between saying they both lived in New York in 1995 versus I need a time-stacked photo of them shaking hands in New York in 1995. It was a brilliantly strict filter.
He wasn't simply acting as a human filing cabinet, though. He was actively interpreting the law. A major innovation of his work is something called the tarjama. These were the chapter headings he used to organize the vast collection of texts.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He didn't use generic chapter titles like Chapter 4 on prayer. He used the headings to embed his own legal reasoning.
Exactly.
For example, he might title a chapter The Obligation of Prayer, but the actual hadiths he places underneath that heading might only vaguely imply that prayer is obligated, without explicitly stating it.
By doing that, he is showing his hand as a jurist. He's using the physical arrangement of the text to guide the reader toward a specific legal conclusion. The book becomes simultaneously a collection of historical reports and a deeply structured, personal work of jurisprudence.
And because this text became the bedrock for Islamic law and theology, it has been heavily scrutinized from every possible angle over the centuries. This brings us to the core of the research, the 100 critical questions aimed at Sahih al-Bukhari. Let's look at how different groups approach this text today, starting with the deep sectarian divides between Sunni and Shia scholars.
The Shia critique of al-Bukhari is foundational to their theology. One of their primary arguments revolves around the statistical representation of narrators. They point out that al-Bukhari includes surprisingly few narrations from the Prophet's own family, known as the al-Bayt.
Right.
For example, Ali ibn Abi Talib, who is a central figure in Islam and the first imam for Shia Muslims, only has about 80 hadiths in the entire collection.
While on the flip side, a companion of the Prophet named Abu Huraira, who converted to Islam just a few years before the Prophet's death, has roughly 2,000 narrations included. For Shia scholars, this massive discrepancy suggests a blatant political bias.
They argue that al-Bukhari favored narratives that supported the ruling Umayyad or Abbasid empires. Those dynasties were often in direct political conflict with the descendants of the Prophet. For the ruling empires, the Prophet's family represented a rival claim to political and religious leadership.
So it was a threat.
Exactly. So the Shia critique posits that al-Bukhari either consciously or subconsciously sidelined the family's narratives to align with the political status quo.
To maintain our impartiality, we have to look at the traditional Sunni response to this claim. Classical Sunni scholars like Ibn Hajar argue that this wasn't a grand political conspiracy at all. They argue it was simply a matter of geographical availability and how transmission networks functioned.
They point out that many narrations from the Prophet's family were kept within private family circles in specific regions early on. Meanwhile, scholars like Abu Huraira dedicated their entire post-conversion lives to publicly teaching, memorizing, and spreading what they heard to hundreds of students in central hubs.
It was just a numbers game, essentially.
From the Sunni perspective, yes. Al-Bukhari was just applying his strict methodology to the networks that were most widely available and verifiable.
But the debates certainly don't stop at sectarian lines. Modern rationalists and scientifically minded critics bring a totally different set of issues to the table, focusing heavily on specific texts within the collection that clash with modern scientific understanding.
There are several highly debated hadiths in this category. The most famous example cited in the research is the Hadith of the fly. It states that if a fly falls into your drink, you should immerse it completely before removing it, because one of its wings carries a disease and the other wing carries the cure.
Another widely debated text describes the sun prostrating under God's throne every night before receiving permission to rise again the next morning. When modern readers encounter these passages, the ideological reactions are incredibly diverse.
We can map out three distinct responses to these scientifically controversial texts. First, you have the literalist traditional approach. They accept these narrations as divine knowledge that supersedes human scientific observation.
How does that apply to the sun prostrating?
Well, for the sun prostrating, they argue the text is describing a metaphysical reality, a spiritual submission to God, not a literal astronomical movement that a telescope could capture.
Then you have the modernist or reformist Muslims. The research highlights scholars like Fazlur Rahman in this camp. They argue that these hadiths reflect the specific cultural context and cosmological beliefs of 7th century Arabia.
The modernist approach is to see these texts as metaphors or culturally specific advice, rather than universal, binding scientific prescriptions for all of time. They argue the core moral message is what matters, not the 7th century scientific framing.
Finally, you have the critiques from atheists or ex-Muslims. They point to these exact same texts as absolute proof of human authorship. They argue that if a text contains statements contradicting established science, it cannot possibly be divinely guided, regardless of how strong the chain of transmission is.
It demonstrates how the exact same words on a page can be read in three entirely different ways, depending on the hermeneutical lens you bring to it. This naturally leads us to perhaps the most intensely debated area of the text today, feminist and gender critiques.
The research addresses several highly controversial narrations regarding women. One prominent example is a hadith, where the Prophet reportedly describes women as being deficient in intelligence and religion. Another major point of contention in modern discourse is the recorded age of Aisha, the Prophet's wife, stating she was 6 at the time of marriage and 9 when it was consummated.
These texts are at the forefront of contemporary debates. The traditional apologetic defense points out that the statement about being deficient in religion referred specifically to the fact that women are exempt from fasting and prayer during menstruation.
So they view it as procedural.
Right, they frame it as a legal exemption, not a moral or intellectual failing. As for Aisha's age, they argue that imposing modern Western concepts of adolescence onto 7th century Arabia is historically anachronistic, noting that such ages of marriage were normative globally at the time.
But other contemporary researchers look at the historical data quite differently. Some Muslim historians cross-reference other historical events from the era, like the age of Aisha's older sister or the exact timing of her conversion to Islam, to argue that the transmission of her age in that specific hadith might actually be a mathematical error by a later narrator.
Based on those historical timelines, they suggest she was likely in her late teens.
Then you have the feminist scholars mentioned in the paper, like Amina Wadud and Keisha Ali. Their approach is much more systemic. They argue that these texts reflect a deeply patriarchal 7th century culture. Their critique isn't just about whether a specific link in the chain is broken.
They question whether the male-dominated networks of narrators over the centuries subtly shaped, selected, or interpreted these texts to reinforce male authority.
It shifts the entire focus of the debate. Instead of asking, is the chain technically sound, they are asking, who built the chain in the first place and what were their cultural blind spots?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it brings us to a fundamental realization about al-Bukhari himself and the world he operated in. We often think of medieval scholars as living in quiet, isolated ivory towers, detached from the real world. But al-Bukhari was deeply entangled in the messy, dangerous politics of his era.
Despite his undisputed genius, his life ended in exile. He was expelled from the major learning center of Nisabur, and eventually he was even driven out of his own hometown of Bukhara. It all revolved around a theological inquisition known as the Mina.
The central political and theological debate of his time was a deeply philosophical question. Was the Quran created by God in time, or was it uncreated and eternal?
To us today, that might sound like splitting theological hairs, but back then, the stakes were massive.
Massive. If the Quran was created, it implied that the caliph, the political ruler, could potentially override it or reinterpret the law for changing times. If it was uncreated and eternal, the religious scholars held the ultimate interpretive power. The ruling powers were literally exiling and imprisoning scholars over this issue.
Al-Bukhari tried to navigate this polarized environment by taking a nuanced middle path. He argued that the Quran itself is the uncreated word of God, but the human act of pronouncing the words with our physical tongues is a created act.
And in a time of extreme political polarization, a nuanced middle path usually just makes everyone angry. The traditionalists thought he was compromising too much, and the rationalists thought he was too conservative. It proves that no matter how revered a scholar is, they are still human, and they are highly vulnerable to the political power struggles of their time.
Given all this polarization, the political biases, and the centuries of transmission, how do modern historians actually figure out what is real?
That is where modern academia has developed some fascinating new tools. Our source highlights a breakthrough methodology called isnad conmatant analysis, heavily developed by the scholar Harold Motzke. Essentially, instead of just evaluating the chain of names or just evaluating the text itself, scholars map out every single variation of a hadith across different geographical regions and early collections.
They are essentially building a massive family tree for a single quote.
Precisely. By cross-referencing all these different branches from Syria, Iraq, and Medina, they can trace the core text back to a common link in the late 1st or early 2nd century of Islam.
Which is pretty incredible.
Because of this method, Western academia has largely moved away from the extreme skepticism of early Orientalist scholars who assumed everything was fabricated, and now acknowledges that many of these oral traditions genuinely do trace back to the early Islamic period, even if specific wordings evolved.
Yet the academics also point out a massive logical puzzle at the heart of the traditional system. The paper calls it the problem of epistemic circularity. It is the ultimate paradox of Hadith sciences.
How do we know a specific historical narrator is trustworthy? Because al-Bukhari included them in his heavily vetted book.
But why do we trust the book? Because it relies on those trustworthy narrators. We trust the chains because they're in the book, and we trust the book because of the chains. So, what does this all mean? Why dedicate a deep dive to a 9th century compilation of oral history? Because Sahih al-Bukhari is not just a medieval religious text, it is a masterclass in one of humanity's earliest and most rigorous attempts at fact-checking and information preservation. It shows us how a society desperately tried to build an objective truth out of human memory.
It also highlights a universal truth about the nature of information. Any text, no matter how meticulously preserved, inevitably becomes a battleground for interpretation. We see traditionalists defending its literal truth, reformists attempting to contextualize it, skeptics dismantling it, and digital age algorithms completely recontextualizing it for new audiences. The text itself stays exactly the same, but the societal lens we view it through changes with every single generation.
It forces us to think deeply about how history is recorded, how implicit biases are passed down through generations, and how incredibly difficult it is to preserve the truth across the centuries.
This raises an important question. We live in an era where we leave massive, supposedly permanent digital footprints. We assume our emails, our photos, our tweets, and our text messages will secure our history forever.
But imagine a scenario where all of those digital records were completely wiped out tomorrow. The servers crash globally, the hard drives fail, the cloud simply evaporates.
If historians 200 years from now had to reconstruct the absolute truth of your life, who you were, what you believed, the exact things you said, and they had to rely entirely on an oral chain of narrators made up of your friends, your coworkers, your political enemies, and passing acquaintances.
Yeah.
Whose chain would they actually trust? Who would be considered an upright narrator of your life? And when they compile the final book, what would your authentic history actually look like?